To see you. It's my huge pleasure to introduce Pascal Hanrahan, an Army chaplain. He's going to say a bit about himself and his tours of duty, and obviously the encounters and experiences that he's had over the years. So I think with no further ado, welcome.
Thank you very much, Georgie. Good afternoon to you all, and welcome. As Georgie said, my name is Pascal Hanrahan. I come in peace, believe it or not, apart from apologise for the dress, and my accent probably might make you a little bit suspicious. These dulcet tones originate from the west of Ireland, Ennis, County Clare. But I've been an Army chaplain now coming on 10 years, and it has been a profound blessing and a privilege to be able to walk with and minister to the men and women that make up the armed forces. The title of this talk, I suppose, is Entrusted with Bringing the Hope of God. And that is actually the title, the motto of the Royal Army Chaplains Department at this particular moment in time. So I'm going to reflect a little bit on that. I tell you from the outset, I'm not an academic and I'm not a theologian. Being Irish, I'm a storyteller, and that's what I'd like to do this afternoon, is to share with you my story. I have been fortunate and indeed blessed to have spent the last almost 10 years now ministering with the Royal Army Chaplains Department. What those years have taught me is that warfare, for all of its violence and controversy and cost, is essentially about people. It's people who do the fighting on behalf of other people and amongst the people in whose country we are operating. So warfare today, and perhaps it was ever thus, is a human activity within which there is, I believe, a very human story. My story began in 2004 when I asked my local bishop, Bishop Willie, to consider my request to join the Royal Army Chaplains Department. I'd never considered myself the most robust of individuals, but I've always had an adventurous spirit, and I wanted to travel and accept exciting challenges. I could never have imagined that this request would see me serving with the British forces on exercises from Kenya to Canada, Salisbury Plain to Poland, on battlefield tours from Arnhem to Anzio, from Mel to Rome and Monte Cassino, on operations in Iraq during periods of the most intensive fighting to the time of the cessation of the UK mission there, and most recently in Afghanistan. The armed forces has taken me places, physically, emotionally, and spiritually, that I could never have imagined. And I've witnessed at first hand, I think, the evil that our human nature is capable of, and something of the hope and the fragile peace that we all long for. I have discovered the importance of remembrance and seen the hope and the healing that it brings. And throughout all of this, I've tried to remain in the midst of the tensions that exist true to my identity as a Christian minister. I am a Catholic Christian in an imperfect world. I believe profoundly in God's love. It is humans that mess things up. And it is into this mess that we who call ourselves Christians are called to bring the message of light, life, and hope. I have discovered that in moments of deep anguish, trial and trauma, that people are looking for more than a friendly face. They are looking for someone to help them discover the meaning of the situation in which they find themselves. Someone to help them make sense of their situation. And this is where I believe that the human story and the divine meet. I believe that Christianity is based on a traumatic event. Crucifixion is an image of trauma, not just the trauma of Christ, but of his followers. And war raises some very deep questions about meaning and meaninglessness. And our young servicemen and women are asking questions, and sometimes deep existential questions. They're looking for something to hold on to as they begin to emerge from the other side. And I believe that Christian theology and Christian spirituality speaks into that something that they are looking for. Because Christian faith tells a story, a large story of how God creates and redeems the world. And each person's story acquires meaning within that large story of God's dealing with humanity. Now, if I had a pound for every time somebody, soldier or other, asked me, "What do you do, Padre?" I wouldn't need to be here today. I would be fishing in the west of Ireland and perhaps enjoying a little drop of some of the finest whiskey that Ireland can produce. But soldiers do ask that question, "What do you do, Padre?" And a famous World War I chaplain, Woodbine Willie, once said, "You live with the men, go where they go, make up your mind that you will share all their risks and more. If you can do any good, you can take it that the best place for a Padre, provided that he does not interfere with military operations, is to be where there is the most danger. Our first job is to go beyond the men in self-sacrifice and reckless devotion. Don't be bamboozled," he said, "into believing that your proper place is behind the line. It isn't. If you stay behind, you might as well come down. You won't do a halfpenny worth of good. Your place is in the front. The line is the key to the whole business of our work. Work in the very front, and they will listen to you when they come out to rest. But if you only preach and teach behind, you're wasting your time. The men won't pay the slightest attention to you. The men will forgive you anything but lack of courage and devotion. Without that, you are useless." Now I think Woodbine Willie's words can be summed up in the following way. I think there is a theology, a spirituality within them as being incarnational, sacrificial, pastoral and devotional. And I think they give us some clue as to the purpose of chaplains within the British forces. Incarnational in the sense that we live with the men and women. We go everywhere they go. We work alongside them in camp. We deploy with them on exercises around the country and around the globe. And we go with them to where the country asks them to go in times of war and conflict. Incarnational. It's sacrificial. Woodbine Willie said, "The more Padres that die doing Christ-like deeds, the better for the church." It's pastoral. Pastoral, he says, "Take a box of fags in your haversack and a great deal of love in your heart." Health and safety doesn't allow us to give out cigarettes anymore, but we do tend to have discovered that the men and women that make up our forces do like a little bit of Moralibo or Haribo. So we take some sweets with us and a great deal of love in our hearts. It's devotional. Woodbine Willie says you can pray with them sometimes, but for them always. Now I remember with amusing clarity my first day reporting for duty. I was posted to the Queen's Royal Lancers based in Catterick Camp. Now I remember arriving at the gate at 07:45. I says, "Oh my God, this is early." Something that I was going to have to get used to. And it was a frosty December morning, and I made my way to the guard room and then to the regimental headquarters, and and I was shaking. I was absolutely nervous. I was a nervous wreck. I was asking myself, what in the name of God am I doing here? At coffee in the mess that morning, I was introduced to the officers of the regiment, and the coffee cup and saucer were now trembling. After coffee, I went for a little drive around the camp, and everyone just waved at me. I thought there was no need to worry. This is wonderful. Until I realized that I was driving around the camp in the wrong direction. It was a one-way system, and they were saying. But I instantly became something of a legend in the eyes of the troops, and a silly git in the eyes of the regimental sergeant major. But I learned very quickly that the secret to success is simply to be yourself and not try to be anything else. And whilst I may wear uniform, I am very much a minister first and foremost, who happens to work with the British forces. Within a few months of being assigned to the Queen's Royal Lancers, I found myself in Iraq for what was called Operation Telic 9. It was to be the bloodiest and the most intense deployment of British forces in that country. We lost 33 soldiers and hundreds were wounded, many with life-changing injuries. Father William Cummings, a padre serving with the US Marines in the Pacific during the Second World War, is often credited with the saying, "There are no atheists in foxholes." The maxim may have grown a little hackneyed over the years, but when our servicemen and women find themselves in the midst of a war zone, their thoughts understandably turn to what might happen if things go wrong. This is where chaplains have a major role to play. In a situation of violence, of despair, of evil, there is a need for someone to be an agent of the presence of God, and perhaps part of our function, I think, may be to humanize the army as much as possible. And my vision for my ministry is that I come along and I hold up the cross. I represent Jesus. I bring Jesus into these situations. Not necessarily to preach, but to bring through this fragile vessel something of his love, something of his compassion, something of his understanding. One of the things that the soldiers wanted to know most of all during that particular tour was their presence in that country making a difference. They really wanted to feel that despite, public opinion and government decisions, that their being there made a difference for the people on the ground. From a personal perspective, I remember the journey across the desert of Iraq with the men and women of the Queen's Royal Lancers, as being a journey in search of meaning, truth, redemption, and hope. To be a padre is to be a minister of hope in what at the time may seem like a hopeless situation. I also believe that as an individual, hope plays an important part in my life. To be hopeful is to be fully human and fully alive. Wherever we find ourselves in life, be it on the front line in Iraq or in the back kitchen in Oxford, we need to remember that all of our thinking and acting take place against a background and a dynamic and changing moods, joy, boredom, fear, sorrow, anxiety, and many other things. I think it was John Macquarie who puts it so well in his book on Christian hope. These are the indexes or registers of the way in which we are at any time related to our environment. Not only the physical environment, but the people whom we are meeting in it. I'm a hopeful person, a very outgoing person, and as such I strive to relate to all those that I come into contact with something of that hope. And this is very important, because if we say that fear is the opposite of hope, and we know that fear leads to a somber mood and causes people to withdraw into themselves and away from the environment in which they find themselves, then we're on the defensive straight away. And this is not what the men and women of the British forces that I've had the privilege to serve and work with look like. Again, as John Macquarie says, the fearing person feels himself threatened by persons, things, or events in the environment, and so he is on the defensive. He is distrustful of the environment, and thus he is unwilling to commit himself to it, and he tends to withdraw into himself. And what is true for the individual is also true for the group and for the community, and ultimately for the human race. Within this context, it was within this context that I found myself during that deployment. It is vitally important that we realise that hope, while primarily directed at the future, cannot be separated from the past and the present moment. Also, while reflecting on the hope of individuals, it's important that I do not lose sight of what it is to hope for a group, like a group of British soldiers. My hopes and their hopes, and the hopes of the people in whose country we found ourselves, are all intermingled. Soldiers are not just mercenaries, and British soldiers have a reputation for being the best in the world. They willingly put their lives on the line, and they volunteer for long periods of separation from their families and loved ones. They want to believe that their presence in a particular theatre of war is for the right reasons, and the hope that their presence will make a difference. I remember on New Year's Day 2007, I found myself on patrol with some soldiers from the Queen's Royal Lancers. We were based in Maysan province, and we were conducting a border control in a sector called Faka. It was quite cold, as is typical for that time of year. We were tired, and in our conversations we were struggling to make sense of what seemed like a meaningless task. Then all of a sudden, as we approached a settlement, we heard a sound that we hadn't heard in several months, and it caught us by surprise. We heard the sound of children playing, and we were, without saying a word, immediately drawn to it. As we drew closer to the settlement, we heard another sound, the sound of a newborn baby. There's something, I think, about the sound of a newborn baby that speaks of hope for all mankind. We were invited to share some food with the people in that settlement, and while speaking with one of them, an elder called Saeed, a 94-year-old sheikh, conversation turned to our presence in their country. And he spoke eloquently of what our presence meant to his family, and how it created an environment where his children and their children could play in relative safety and have a future where education and healthcare and other opportunities were part and parcel of everyday life. It was a chance encounter, but we left that place, I remember, with a spring in our steps, realizing that at times, just being is as important as doing, and that unbeknown to us at times, our presence was having a positive effect. Every little hope is part of a larger hope. So far as the larger hope grows out of the little hopes and are continuous with them, and are the natural fulfillment towards which the little hopes tend. The largest hope of all is the total hope of religion. In St. Thomas's words, the good we should rightly and chiefly hope for from God is an unlimited one, matching the power of God who helps us. It is truly amazing the hope that a newborn child can bring into the world. The Word became flesh and dwelt amongst us. Over the years, critics have repeatedly levelled one major criticism against religions, and particularly against the monotheistic religions. Religions, they contend, are violent. Our religion sparks violence in many concrete situations. Religious people have a ready answer for such critics who deride religion as violent. It is that those who use faith to justify violence are misusing faith precisely to the extent that they are doing what the critics object to. As a Christian, I would argue that Christian faith, when properly understood and faithfully practiced, fosters peace rather than legitimizes violence. And I think adherents of other religions would make a very similar argument. But even if this rebuttal by religious people is plausible, it is troubling, I think, how often our faiths, in fact, do get implicated in violence. From Bosnia to Sri Lanka, from the caves of Afghanistan to Northern Ireland, from the temples in India to the tomb of the patriarchs in Palestine. These actual and disturbing malfunctions of faith blow wind, I think, into our critics' sails. I am, however, absolutely convinced that one of the roles of a military chaplain is to be an agent of peace and reconciliation in theatres of war. Faith, I believe, is a source of blessing. It is a source of deliverance. Faith is a source of guidance. And I think it ultimately defines what is right and wrong, which course of action to take and which to avoid. This is so important, I think, in the battlefield. Faith is a source of meaning. It offers an overarching interpretation of reality within which the life of each individual finds its proper and unique purpose, and which shapes what it means to live well. Christian faith, as I've said earlier, tells a large story of how God creates and redeems the world. And each person's story acquires meaning within the context of that story, the story of God's indwelling with humanity. I have begun over the years to understand the key role of reconciliation in the search of peace. Firstly, authentic peace will not result from a greater force subduing a lesser force. This is a far cry from genuine peace, which in the Hebrew tradition of shalom means not simply the absence of conflict, but also the presence of human flourishing. And it takes love to make peace, and it takes peace to achieve reconciliation. Christianity is a religion of love. Its central claim is that God is love, and as such, God loves not only those who are lovable, but also those who most decidedly are unlovable. In the Christian account, the active love of God towards those who are divinely unlovable is the key to reconciliation between God and humanity, and thus the model for reconciliation in human relationships is found. The desire for it, I believe, must come from within. To reconcile, we must desire, however tenuously, halting and ambivalently. We need to embrace the enemy. For Christians, this is born out of the belief that both we and our enemies are loved by one and the same God. In every conflict, there is much to forgive on all sides. Some of the most disturbing images from conflicts have been the misbehaviour of the few. The coin of forgiveness has two sides: naming the wrongdoing and restitution, used post bellum. Reconciliation involves forgiveness and the restoration of mutual respect. And this is one area, I think, where faith and our Christian social teaching and just war theory can speak with conviction in a war zone. I returned to Iraq in 2007 on Operation Telic 13, the last one. And there I witnessed firsthand the transformation of a city which 2 years previously was completely and utterly out of bounds. I was able to wander down the bazaars of Basra amid the hustle and bustle of market stalls selling exotic fruit, with the sounds and smells not of gunfire and bombs anymore, but vendors and street sellers and people haggling over prices. I saw our engineers building and repairing bridges, physical and metaphorical. And I was also able to celebrate Mass with Bishop Imad of Basra in the Chaldean rite, in the language that Jesus himself spoke. It was for me and those that I served alongside a tour where we all experienced the healing of memories. The need for the healing of memories is so obvious when we come face to face with violent death. I remember once being asked by a commander if I could celebrate Mass in the centre of Basra in the Pijot building, the middle of downtown Basra, for a company of soldiers who, because of where they were located, didn't get a whole lot of visitors, and they were continually coming under fire. Transport was arranged, and I was a very welcome visitor. And after spending some time with the lads there drinking coffee, I celebrated Mass, and I could sense actually how much it meant to them. That evening I spoke with their troop commander, a young officer, not long out of Entrusted, Jonathan Bradshaw Cook. He told me how he was looking forward to his forthcoming wedding and how much he missed his fiancée and family. But what a privilege it was, he said, to be a troop commander with some amazing soldiers. He also told me how much his faith meant to him, particularly over the last few months. It was with a heavy heart that I left that location the following morning. I got a lift. That young troop commander and his troop were going to Basra Palace, and I could travel with them. After all the normal checks were done, we were loaded up in a convoy of 4 warrior armoured vehicles. 10 minutes later, there was a sound that I will never forget. There was an IED strike, and the young commander was killed. I was able to say prayers for him there on the spot, and to escort his body back to Basra Palace, and be there with his troop, and be able to celebrate a vigil service with them. And I know that that meant an awful lot to them, as later that same evening they had to make the return journey back to their base in the city. But I know that having that time and space to pause, reflect, remember and pray was important for them all. Shortly after my return to the UK, I met that young commander's family and his fiancée, still devastated, but they appreciated that there was a chaplain with him when he died. That young man was just one of many who paid the ultimate price. I was, as I have already alluded to, in Iraq at the time of the end of the combat mission. And I remember plans were going ahead to somehow mark the end of the combat mission in Iraq and the handover to the Americans. And I remember being at one of those meetings and suggesting that perhaps we should have a memorial service prior to the handing over, and to remember our 179 fallen comrades. I suggested that we call out each name. They initially thought that would be too long, Padre. Nice idea, but it would take too long. But I said, I think it's important that we call out their name. I think it's important that we remember their sacrifice and acknowledge their sacrifice. And I think it would be important for their families and their loved ones. I suggested that we needed to hear those names, that we owed it to them and their families. We did. We had this service, and I think it was the right thing to do. Because I think the very act of calling names is a potent one. Each name unique, each name telling its own story. The story of a son or a daughter, a husband or a wife, a father or a mother. Each name evoking very powerful memories. For some of us, it was the memory of a friend or a colleague, a mate, someone who was part of our unit, someone who we trained with and served alongside, someone who was always there for us, somebody who made us laugh when perhaps we needed to do just that, someone we looked up to, somebody we admired. And as I listened to each name being called out on that April day in 2009, I could not help but reflect that the story of each one would merge with the bigger story. Faith imbues the story of the fallen with a deeper significance and meaning. It gives it a hope beyond all telling. Having just returned from Afghanistan a few months ago, I know that there are many soldiers who continue to do what Christ did, to lay down their lives. It is the selfless commitment of so many members of our armed forces that we traditionally remember at this time of year. The trenches of the First and Second World Wars, the Falklands, Iraq and Afghanistan, and so many other areas are the places where brave young men and women have died to help make this world a better place, a safer place to bring up our children. I know that many of our servicemen and women might not be religious in the church-going sense of the word, but they too see the importance of remembering, as they recognize that we will never have a future if we don't remember the lessons of the past. By learning from the past, we get better. We learn to overcome differences. We forgive past wrongs. We enable reconciliation, healing to take place. For us who are religious, we can highlight a supreme example of service, forgiveness and sacrifice. Jesus gave his life that we might live. He came to serve, not to be served. I think the death and resurrection of Jesus gives us great hope, as it proves that death does not have the final word. Jesus teaches us that nothing comes between us and the love of God. God loved us so much that he gave us his only Son. And just as we remember the sacrifice of Jesus, I think we're called to mark the sacrifice of the fallen by refusing to forget them. We wear a poppy, and I think the very powerful symbol, the red of the poppy, speaks of the blood that they have shed. The black heart speaks of seeds and of lives that have fallen into the ground and died, and will one day rise again to make a new life with God. And the green stem and leaf of the poppy speak of the new life, forever springing from the life. I was very struck, as I'm sure you may have been, at that artistic installation at the Tower of London. And I got up early one morning and got the train to London and spent a few moments wandering around the moat. And I was struck by the sheer scale of it, 888,246 poppies, almost flowing around the moat of the Tower of London. And I was struck. Each one, of course, were an individual who lost their lives during the First World War. But I was struck how something that reminds us, tells the story of something so terrible, could, in a moment, also look so profoundly beautiful and have transformed the landscape. And I thought, of course, of poppies growing in the fields, the battlefields of the First World War. Poppies, in order to grow, I've learned, need the earth to be almost violently disturbed. And of course the earth was pounded by the munitions, and disturbed the earth. And this enabled the poppy to grow. And I can almost imagine our troops seeing these flowers, wild flowers, emerging from the broken earth and looking at it as almost something beautiful coming out of something horrendous. And of course, those who lost their lives in the First World War were probably far more religious than those who currently serve the forces, and they would have got this sense, no doubt, I think, of the hope and the resurrection of the battlefield, transformed battlefield. It's almost like the way of sorrow and pain and brokenness and violence and opening up into a way of beauty. The Via Dolorosa becomes the Via Pulchridinis, the way of beauty, the way of beauty. So we remember the mark and the sacrifice of the fallen by refusing to forget them. We share the grief, the pain of those who have lost loved ones, partners, children, parents, friends and colleagues. We do that by remembering. I want to come now to the conclusion. I am a non-combatant. Believe it or believe it not. I do not believe in violence. It goes against everything that I hold dear. I do not know how I would react in a firefight. I have found myself lying in the dirt and the dust of Iraq and Afghanistan so many times now, and it doesn't get any easier. There are so many questions. Is it possible for the church which I love to disapprove of the war that those I minister find themselves? Yes, it is. I was very much aware that my church had spoken out against the morality of the Iraq war. The soldiers themselves questioned it at times. But I was there, I believe, not to oil the machinery of war or to condone the war. I was there to minister to the people, the humanity that's caught up in it. I haven't given them a blessing and said, the church is behind you. But what I have been able to do is say to them is that there are people praying for us as we are deployed here. Padres are not there to justify the conflicts that the army is in. Our purpose is to walk with the men and women who serve, to be there for them. And I think there's a tension. There has to be. But most of us are in a position where we realize that the government makes the decision. It's not the army that makes the decision to go to war. If our government decides it is something that we should be engaged in, then our soldiers are required to do it. And they need chaplains. They need chaplains just like everybody else in life needs chaplains. And I think that we should be there for them. There's an element in me that thinks that the people we are fighting have families, and equally our soldiers have families. So it points out very clearly the whole Christian view of violence and the ambiguity of a chaplain's position. I think it's very important that they know people care for them. Just because they've been told to go and do something that they may or may not like or believe in, I think it's very important that we as Christian ministers go and stand alongside them and say, people care about you, God cares about you, and in those dark places that you're going to go, we will go with you. It's important that in the midst of a broken world, that God loves them. And you know, I'm getting kind of fond of him myself. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I hope that was all right. I ramble at time. I'm Irish, so I ramble. You know.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much.
That's all.
Are you willing to take?
Oh, I am, as long as they're not hard questions. Yes, sir.
Sorry, I can't what denomination.
Oh, I'm a grumpy old Catholic priest.
Particularly regards the Lords, how deep an understanding did they have of Christian faith, and also with the officers, and how did you address this problem?
So I think actually the army that I serve is actually a little more religious than we might at first think. And this has many historical reasons that many of the people who make up the armed forces come from the Commonwealth, and they come into the forces with a very strong sort of Christian faith. Many of the officers have gone to various public schools that had either a Protestant or a Catholic ethos, and within some of the units that I've served in, the concept of the church parade is still something that is valued. I think what we bring, whilst we might not always be able to express it in a coherent manner, is something that is valued by those that serve in the armed forces. Because you know the concept of what the armed forces is about, the selfless commitment, the sense of sacrifice, the ideals and the values that it tries to uphold in its everyday life, are strongly, Christian in their origin. And whilst people might not necessarily admit it, I think they're open to it. I don't know if that answers your question.
Did you find them more religious when they left the service than when they took the first job?
I found them more religious when they were on operations, I can tell you. Yeah, I found them more religious. I mean, we tried everywhere we went to conduct services on operations, be it at and we tried to go to even the most remote locations and deliver a service. We don't follow the rules that Sunday is Sunday. We follow the rule that wherever you find yourself in any particular day, it's Sunday, and we offered Sunday services. And whether it was because maybe there was no other option entertainment-wise or whatever like that, they did tend to come to church, and they really appreciated it, I think, the visit. And they appreciated the sense of knowing that there was people back at home who were thinking about them. There was communities who, remember them either in the bidding prayers or whatever, and there was people who sent out tremendous, particularly this time of year, who sent out so many parcels and messages of goodwill to the armed forces personnel. They knew that the people in the UK, by and large, appreciated the job that they were doing in places, even if they didn't agree with the conflict. they still knew that the men and women who make up the armed forces were worth supporting. And I think the images that we all saw on our TV screens, particularly Wootton Bassett, now Royal Wootton Bassett, I think captured, profound respect of the nation for its warriors. And I think galvanised a tremendous support for our people. No.
Thank you very much. In the 10 years nearly that you've been in, have you had any